In this video, we're going to continue our look at filters in Photoshop, and we're going to move on to some of the filters that we have available to us in this area here, in this midsection. And blur is one that you're likely going to use a lot. And blur actually can be used in a lot of different forms and a lot of different ways, and I'll show you some examples in this section here. But and I'm not going to take time to go through every single one of these because there's really no need to do that. Gaussian blur is probably one of the more popular blurs that you'll use just because it's a consistent, even blur that you can apply to whatever you're working on. And you might think, well, why would I blur the owl here? But you might notice that the original is kind of a little punchy. It has some pixelizing in it, and I picked this one on purpose just so that you could see that there's some pixelizing here and that we can actually use blur to remove some of that pixelizing without really losing the effect of what we have from the eagle here. And then we can actually also then use another filter, sharpen, to bring back some of that detail without gaining all of that extra pixelization that was happening here earlier. Another type of blur that we can use, and we may use quite a bit, is motion blur. And motion blur basically makes it look like an object is moving. And probably one of the best ways of using that is if you have an object that's isolated, make a copy of that layer and then apply motion blur to the one layer so that it looks like the object is moving down the road. Like for instance, let me take a quick silhouette. So let's see, probably the easiest way to do that in this case would be to use quick selection tool. And so I'm just gonna do this really quick so you can see how it works, since this particular area is not a demonstration on the quick select tool. Okay, so I have basically the green selected. I'm going to feather the selection slightly, and then Control Shift I to invert it, and then Control C to copy, Control V to paste. So you notice that we now have the background gone pretty effectively. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is make a copy of the background just by dragging it and dropping it onto the create a new layer. And I'm going to come up to filter and choose our blur, motion blur, and then just start increasing the distance. And so you can see where it kind of looks like it adds a completely different look to the photograph here, because it looks like the owl is shifting its head just a little bit or something like that. And so you can have a lot of fun in playing around with this effect. You can even do something like make a copy of the owl itself and apply the blur just to that so that it isn't picking up any of the green. Let me just turn these two channels off. Come to blur, motion blur, and you notice that it's a lot more subtle here. You can't see it as much. And you notice if I turn it off, it's kind of gone. But here's one thing that you can do. Because we have this motion blur, I can select this layer, choose the move tool, and just scoot the image over here like that so that it has a lot of the color relationships that the owl has, because it's sampling these colors off of the owl itself. Now you'll notice that there's a little bit of fringing still with the green, and that's actually easy to remove. We could just take the eraser tool and just even with the default 13 pixels and just come along here and just erase along that edge. And you notice that I'm not really stressing so much about ever being precise, because it's more about appearance than anything. And in some cases, like where his body is already out of focus, it may actually make sense to turn the hardness down and the brush size up so that it kind of blends into the background even more. Just maybe soften that edge just a little bit. So you can see where just with a couple quick tools and in combination with the motion blur, we can get a pretty interesting effect off of our owl compared to the original that we had. So there was our original, and this is the new version. So just one way that you can use motion blur. The next type of blur that I want to bring your attention to is the radial blur. We're going to switch pictures to take a look at the radial blur here. I have this architectural dome, and radial blur basically finds, well, I'll show you what it does and then I'll explain how to control it better. So I'm going to select radial blur, and it basically does two things. You can either have it blur in a spin form or in a zoom form. Quality I usually go with best, and so with the amount, the higher you increase it, the more it spins. So like, just for the sake of saving time on the video, I'm going to select good, and we'll go with, let's just increase it to 100% just so you can see the dramaticness of the effect. So you can see what it did with the picture. Okay, it just totally spun it. If I turn down that effect to say 50%, you notice that there's a little bit more detail, but still you really can't see what it is. So you can actually control the end result of what you're going to get based on the amount that you're applying it. Okay, so it definitely has some isolated uses, but you can see where you could still do some pretty cool things with it. And then the other version of it, of course, is zoom, and I actually use this a lot, more than I would think. If I just go to 100% and click OK, it just kind of zooms out from the central portion here. So it's a pretty cool effect, isn't it? And then, of course, if we turn that amount down to 35, it kind of looks like you're flying down into a tunnel or something. Doesn't this almost look like a scene out of Star Wars now? You know, like you're going down through a tunnel into this central area here, and these are windows and machine panels and all that kind of stuff. I mean, it's just kind of cool. Now, let me show you a special effect that is actually really cool that you may use radial blur for in real world settings. Okay, so what I'm going to do is we'll just stay with this photo and add a new layer, and I'm going to fill the layer to black. So edit, fill, I have the foreground color set to black. Next, I'm going to create a new layer. Now, once I create this new layer, it's going to be blank. One thing that I need to do is find the center, both horizontally and vertically. One of the ways to do that is to left mouse click, and whenever you left mouse click and drag from the ruler area, it creates a guide, and by default Photoshop snaps to center on that guide. Same with coming from above, left mouse click and drag, it snaps to center. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create a custom shape, and I'm going to scroll down, and what I want to see is, see what we got here for stars. We have these. That one there is unusual, that flower petal. These are all very symmetrical. Actually, let's just go with this 8-point star. Or no, you know what? Let's go with this one because it's a starburst, but it's unusually shaped. And I'm going to just draw that shape here. And we're going to center it. It filled with black because that's the foreground color that I had. And actually, I think center is going to be slightly off center for us. Now, one thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to turn the black back on. One thing I'm going to do, I'm going to leave the shape here, but I'm going to create a new layer by clicking again. And I'm going to control click the shape. That'll turn it into a selection. And I'm going to fill that with white. Fill white. Okay. Deselect it. Now, we're going to come up to Filter, Blur, Radial Blur. And I want to zoom 100%. And watch what happens. We get this interesting starburst. Okay, now what's really cool is that we can actually continue to apply that filter, and the more we do, just by hitting Radial Blur again, it starts to increase that into a starburst. If you want to add a little more detail, we can lock the layer momentarily, come up to Filter, choose Noise, Add Noise, and we're going to look at noise here more in a minute. Add a little bit of color noise to it, click OK. Unlock the layer, and then go back to our Radial Blur. And let's change it to best. And apply it a couple times. And so now you can see what's happening is, we'll hide those guides there. We have this starburst that's happening, and it's not completely symmetrical because of the shape that we used. But what's really cool is that it's transparent because we created it on a layer. So then I have now this starburst that I can apply to anything, like coming from the lamp or however I want to use that. If I set the blending mode from normal to, say, screen, it looks like that lamp there is shining. Okay, so there's a number of ways that you can use this. You could actually even make it smaller just to create a small shimmer on glass or something like that. So it's just a real world way of using Radial Blur. Okay. All right, next, another thing that I want to take a look at on Blur here. Let me choose the background. And let's see. Yeah, I think we'll stick with this image. With Blur, Shape, Smart Blur, and Surface Blur. Smart Blur and Surface Blur are pretty cool tools because one of the things that it does is it actually gives you the ability to maintain a level of detail while getting rid of some of the imperfections in an object. And to demonstrate that, let me increase the size of this image up to double, 150. And actually, let's resample it. And so you can see just by doing that, because it was a low resolution image, you can see the pixelizing and all that kind of stuff that's happening there in the image. Okay, so Surface Blur and Smart Blur can help us fix some of that image. And it depends on the type of image that you're working with. One may work better than the other, but they both work very similarly. So I'm going to choose Surface Blur first. Usually what I do is I work with a quality of high. And just by controlling threshold and radius will determine how little or how much of the effect is being applied. And you can see that the more I turn down threshold, the more detail shows up. And then the more I increase radius, it amplifies what you're doing with threshold. So there's a matter of finding a happy balance in there, but you notice how it's maintaining edges. Okay, so if I increase threshold even more, you see now I'm starting to lose detail. But compare the original here with what we're seeing on the screen. So you can see where it's smoothing out or blurring parts of the solid colors while maintaining the integrity of the edges, which is really how this tool works well. Similarly, Surface Blur does the same basic thing, except that it averages it a little bit differently. And I think in some cases, especially in this case, we're getting a better job, and it's actually applying it in real time. You can see the before and after. And so it's maintaining a level of integrity. And again, we can increase the radius, and that'll increase the level of blur. But in this case, because it's surface blur, instead of completely blurring the pixels that are there, it's creating a blur and applying it on top of the pixels that's there. That's the difference. Okay, and that's why it can mimic the effect that we saw in Smart Blur, but it works a little bit differently in maintaining levels of detail. So now if I hit the preview and turn it off and just again look in this area right here, that's what the photograph looks like right now. If I hit preview, you notice how it's starting to smooth that out. Okay, and the last one that we'll look at with blur specifically is shape blur. And this just basically gives you the ability to blur an object based on a shape. Okay, so it applies that shape as a way of blurring the image, which, I don't know, to me is kind of weird. I've never actually used this much other than just to acknowledge the fact that it's there. But I guess, you know, there's some situations where you could get a pretty cool effect with it. Like if you look at the star pattern in the center of the roof, you can see how the blur is actually affecting what you're getting out of that star pattern. So definitely can get some interesting effects for sure, especially if you're working with a symmetrical image like this, and I'm choosing symmetrical designs, you know, as opposed to like an eye. So you can see where, you know, there may be some isolated scenarios where this could work well for you. So next we have Distort. And Distort, we're not going to spend a lot of time on this. I'm going to just point out a few that I think you may be able to use on a regular basis. The rest of these I'd encourage you to experiment with. First, we're going to look at Twirl. And Twirl is what you think it is. You're just taking the center point and you're twirling it around. So if I hit apply, you can see where it's just swirling around. And again, there's some isolated applications for this, but water is one that it actually works really well with. Another that may be useful for you is wave. And I found that this can actually be a lot of fun if you are trying to create custom patterns or effects. You can increase the number of generators, how long the wavelengths are. The longer, obviously, the more detail. The shorter, the less detail. So there's an element of randomness to it, but not really. Same with amplitude. And so like if I wanted to turn this photograph into some kind of a funky generic pattern, this would be the tool to do that. Kind of looks a little bit like paper marbling, if you've ever seen that. Also, Zig Zag is another one that you may use on occasion, and it basically works like ripples in water, and you can see the end result there, and even the definition, pond ripples out around center, out from center. So we can increase that amount, and it works very, very similar to ripples in water, which is actually a pretty cool effect. So that's Distort. The last one that we're going to look at here in this video is Pixelate. And again, this is very specialized filters, so you're not going to use them on a regular basis. One that you may want to look at is Mezzotint, because it basically breaks down your image into a series of low quality dots. And you can control the size of the dots or the lines. So it's definitely an effect driven kind of scenario. The other one under Pixelate is Alized, which is kind of similar, except it breaks it down into a different kinds of dots than what we were looking at, more cells. So you can get some pretty interesting effects, as you can see, a little bit kind of like stained glass in a way, actually. But this is a cool filter to use to take regular photographs and turn it into, you know, funky digital backgrounds that you may want to use for other projects. And let me see if there's anything else that I really want to point out. Crystallize faucet fragment. These all pretty much work the same. Color halftone basically just turns it into a halftone that you would see like in an old newspaper or magazine. So very isolated effect.